June 3, 1864. Cold Harbor, Virginia. Just after 4:30 in the morning, 3 Union corps rose from their trenches and walked forward into the mist. Within minutes, the fields in front of the Confederate lines were carpeted with men who would never stand again. Soldiers had pinned scraps of paper with their names and home addresses to the backs of their jackets the night before, so their bodies could be identified after the attack failed. They already knew what was coming. Lieutenant General Ulysses S. Grant, commander of all Union armies, had ordered the assault, and by the time it was called off, thousands of his men lay dead or dying in front of works that never broke. Newspapers in the North would soon have a new name for him, not the quiet tanner's son from Ohio, not the victor of Vicksburg, the butcher. So how does a general branded with that name become the man who finally wins the war he was supposed to be losing his own army in? To understand Cold Harbor, you have to go back 3 years, to a man nobody expected much from. Before the war, Ulysses Grant had failed at farming, failed at selling real estate, and was working as a clerk in his father's leather goods store in Illinois when the Confederacy opened fire on Fort Sumter. He was 39 years old, with no fortune and a reputation for drinking that followed him out of the peacetime army, a reputation serious enough that he had resigned his commission years earlier rather than face a formal inquiry into his conduct. He had graduated from West Point in the middle of his class, served competently but without distinction in the Mexican-American War, and then drifted through one failed venture after another in civilian life. Nobody who knew him before 1861 expected him to become the most important soldier of his generation. The war gave him a second chance most men his age never get. He raised a regiment, then a brigade, then a district command, and by February of 1862, he had done something almost nobody else in blue had managed. At Fort Donelson in Tennessee, when the Confederate commander asked for terms, Grant answered that no terms except unconditional and immediate surrender could be accepted. The phrase spread through Northern papers within days. Unconditional Surrender Grant, they called him, turning his own initials into a slogan, and for a few short weeks that winter, he was the most celebrated man in the Union. Then came Shiloh in April of that same year, and the nickname the papers would use against him for the rest of his career. Confederate forces struck Grant's army by surprise near a small log church in Tennessee, and for one brutal day, the Union lines nearly broke. Grant held on, brought up reinforcements overnight, and drove the Confederates from the field the next morning. But the cost stunned the country. Total casualties on both sides ran well past 20,000 men, more than every previous American war combined up to that point. Northern newspapers, looking for someone to blame for a victory that felt like a catastrophe, found their target. Grant had been caught unprepared, they said, and had paid for it in blood he did not need to spend. The word butcher appeared in print for the first time attached to his name. It would not be the last. He answered his critics the only way he knew how, by winning. At Vicksburg, the fortress city perched above the Mississippi River that the Confederacy needed to hold if it wanted to keep the river open for its own supply and split the Union in two, Grant executed one of the boldest campaigns of the entire war. Rather than approach the city directly, he marched his army down the western bank of the river, crossed south of the city with the help of the Navy, and then did something his own superiors considered close to reckless. He cut his army loose from its supply lines entirely and struck out into hostile territory, living off the land as he moved. In the space of 18 days, his forces fought and won 5 separate battles, drove a Confederate army back into Vicksburg's defenses, and settled in for a siege. Union artillery and gunboats pounded the city for weeks, while its defenders and civilians dug caves into the hillsides to survive the bombardment, and starvation did the rest of the work that shellfire could not. The garrison surrendered on the 4th of July, 1863, the same week as the Union victory at Gettysburg, and nearly 30,000 Confederate soldiers laid down their arms. The Mississippi River was now open to Union control from its source to the Gulf, and the Confederacy had been cut in two. Later that year, at Chattanooga in Tennessee, Grant arrived to find a Union army nearly surrounded and running out of food on the banks of the Tennessee River. Within weeks, he had opened a supply line, reinforced the garrison, and launched an assault that drove Confederate forces off high ground so steep that even Grant's own officers had not expected the attacking troops to reach the top. President Abraham Lincoln, who had grown tired of generals who would not fight and who kept finding reasons to retreat, had finally found the man he needed. In March of 1864, Lincoln promoted Grant to lieutenant general, a rank no American had held since George Washington, and gave him command of every Union army in the field, east and west alike. Grant brought a new philosophy east with him, one he had already proven worked. He described it himself in terms almost anyone could understand. Find out where your enemy is. Get at him as soon as you can. Strike him as hard as you can and as often as you can, and keep moving on. Those were reportedly his own words for the strategy, and in the West that philosophy had produced victories. In Virginia, against Robert E. Lee, it was about to produce the bloodiest 6 weeks of the entire war. The campaign began in early May of 1864 in a tangled forest of scrub oak and undergrowth called the Wilderness, not far from where a previous Union army had been humiliated a year earlier at Chancellorsville. Grant's army, well over 100,000 strong, collided with Lee's smaller army of Northern Virginia in terrain so thick that officers could not see their own regiments, let alone the enemy, and entire brigades lost each other within a few hundred feet of open ground. Artillery was nearly useless in the dense timber, so the fighting came down to men firing blindly into undergrowth at muzzle flashes they could barely see. Fires broke out in the tangled brush from the constant rifle fire and burned wounded men where they lay, unable to crawl free before the flames reached them, one of the more horrifying details soldiers on both sides carried home from the war. When the 2 days of fighting ended, close to 18,000 Union soldiers and roughly 11,000 Confederates were dead, wounded, or missing, and the tactical result was essentially a draw. Every general before Grant who had fought Lee to a draw in Virginia had pulled back afterward to regroup, resupply, and lick his wounds before trying again months later. Grant did something none of them had done. He ordered the army to march south that same night, deeper into Confederate territory, toward Lee rather than away from him. When his exhausted soldiers realized which direction the column was turning at a crossroads south of the battlefield, veterans who had endured defeat after defeat under previous commanders reportedly began to cheer in the darkness, some tossing their caps in the air along the roadside. For the first time in 3 years of war, they understood they were serving under a general who would not quit no matter how the last fight had gone. What followed was the Overland Campaign, and it delivered exactly the reputation the newspapers had already given him. At Spotsylvania Courthouse, the armies fought for nearly 2 weeks around a horseshoe-shaped Confederate position soldiers would remember as the Bloody Angle. For close to 20 hours straight on May 12th, men fought hand-to-hand in trenches filled with rain and mud, close enough in places to grab each other across the earthworks or stab through gaps in the log breastworks with bayonets. Officers on both sides later said they had never witnessed fighting so sustained or so intimate anywhere else in the war. Trees more than a foot thick were cut clean through by the sheer volume of rifle fire passing over the lines, toppling onto the men fighting beneath them. It was during this same stretch of fighting that Grant sent a message back to Washington summarizing his intentions in a line that would follow him for the rest of his life. He wrote that he proposed to fight it out on this line if it took all summer, a sentence Northern papers printed widely as proof of either his determination or his stubbornness, depending on which paper a reader picked up. Grant pushed on to the North Anna River later that month, probing again for a way around Lee's flank, and was blocked again by fortifications so strong that he chose to disengage rather than force another costly assault. Then came Cold Harbor, the assault that would define him in the public mind more than any battle he ever won. The numbers from the Overland Campaign as a whole are, even today, hard to absorb. Union losses across the roughly 6 weeks from the Wilderness through Cold Harbor totaled somewhere near 55,000 men, killed, wounded, captured, or missing, a figure historians still refine but do not seriously dispute in its broad scale. Confederate losses, though harder to pin down precisely because Southern record-keeping had begun to break down, are most commonly estimated at around 30 to 35,000. Grant's own army had suffered more casualties in 6 weeks than Lee had soldiers in his entire command at the campaign's start. It is worth saying plainly that the specific claim, repeated for generations, that 7,000 Union soldiers fell in a single 20-minute span at Cold Harbor is a figure historians still debate rather than a settled fact. The overall assault was catastrophic, and the single morning of June 3rd was undeniably one of the worst hours of the war for Union arms, but the precise minute-by-minute count has never been nailed down the way popular memory insists it has. What is not in dispute is the reaction it produced. Grant himself later wrote that he regretted ordering the final assault at Cold Harbor more than any other decision of the war, since no advantage was gained to compensate for the losses. Secretary of the Navy. Gideon Welles recorded in his diary around this time that sentiment in Washington had turned bitter toward Grant, with critics inside Lincoln's own government beginning to question whether the campaign could be sustained. The nickname stopped being a newspaper insult and became, for a stretch of weeks in the summer of 1864, something close to conventional wisdom in the North. Grant the Butcher was not just a headline anymore. It was how a large portion of the country had come to see the man leading their sons into Virginia. What critics missed then, and what many still miss now, is the arithmetic underneath the horror. Lee's army, smaller and with a far thinner pool of replacements, was being ground down proportionally faster than Grant's, even though the raw Union casualty totals looked worse on a printed page. Historians who have gone back through the full record of Grant's career, from Fort Donelson through Vicksburg, Chattanooga, and the Overland Campaign, have found that across the entire war, his armies inflicted more casualties on their opponents than they suffered themselves, a ratio that does not match the Butcher caricature at all. Grant understood something his predecessors in Virginia had refused to accept. The Confederacy could not replace its dead the way the Union could. Every battle, however costly, was draining a well that Lee could not refill. It was not recklessness. It was the coldest kind of math, applied by a man willing to be hated for doing it. After Cold Harbor, Grant did not retreat, and he did not repeat the mistake. He disengaged his army in one of the most skillful maneuvers of the entire war, marching it south under cover of darkness and bridging the wide James River with a pontoon crossing built in a single night, moving an army of over 100,000 men across the water before Lee even realized the Army of the Potomac had left his front. His target was Petersburg, a quiet rail junction south of Richmond that carried nearly every supply line still feeding Lee's army and the Confederate capital beyond it. Had the first Union assault on the town's thin defenses been pressed with full force, Petersburg likely would have fallen within days, and the war might have ended that summer. It did not happen, and the chance slipped away. Grant made a decision that broke from everything the newspapers expected of the man they had branded a butcher. He settled in for a siege. For 9.5 months, through the fall and winter of 1864 into the spring of 1865, Grant slowly extended his lines around Petersburg, corps by corps, cutting one supply route after another and forcing Lee's already thin army to stretch across more and more miles of trenches it did not have the men to properly hold. There was no more headlong slaughter. There was patience, engineering, and slow strangulation. The man accused of throwing lives away without thought spent the better part of a year refusing to throw a single unnecessary life away, because the arithmetic of the siege was already doing the work for him. Soldiers on both sides spent that winter living in dugouts and trenches within earshot of each other, trading potshots and occasional truces, while behind Confederate lines desertion climbed and rations shrank month by month. By late March of 1865, Lee's position had become impossible. His lines were stretched to breaking, His men were hungry, and Grant's superior numbers finally broke through at a crossroads called Five Forks, forcing Lee to abandon both Petersburg and Richmond in the same week. Lee tried to escape west, hoping to link up with the last Confederate forces still in the field and continue the war. But Grant's cavalry and infantry moved faster than his exhausted columns could march. Union troops got ahead of the retreating Confederates and blocked the road forward, leaving Lee's army surrounded and starving. On April 9th, at a small courthouse village called Appomattox, Robert E. Lee surrendered the Army of Northern Virginia to Ulysses S. Grant. The terms Grant offered were generous rather than punishing. Confederate officers were permitted to keep their sidearms and horses, and any soldier who owned a horse or mule was allowed to take it home for the spring planting rather than surrender it as government property. Grant later wrote that he felt no elation at the moment of victory, only sadness at the downfall of an enemy who had fought so long and so well. Within days, word reached Union camps across the South, and the war that had cost more American lives than any conflict before or since was effectively over. The general they had called a butcher had done what none of his predecessors in Virginia could do. He had actually finished the job. History has spent more than a century and a half arguing over how to weigh those two facts against each other. The casualty figures from the Overland Campaign are real, and the horror of Cold Harbor does not need exaggeration to be understood as one of the darkest mornings of the entire war. But so is the fact that Grant's strategy, brutal as it looked splashed across newspaper front pages, was the strategy that actually ended the killing by ending the war itself in a matter of months, rather than allowing it to grind on for years the way a more cautious approach might have. Historians who compare Grant's full record against the generals who came before him in Virginia point out that his predecessors, timid as they were with their men's lives in any single battle, presided over years of stalemate that cost the Union far more soldiers in the aggregate than Grant's aggressive final campaign ever did. The soldiers who served under him, the men who had watched other generals retreat after every hard fight only to face the same enemy again. Months later, no better positioned than before, came to trust him in a way they never trusted his predecessors, because he never once turned the army around and marched it backward. That trust followed him out of the war. He went on to serve 2 terms as President of the United States, elected twice by a country that, whatever it called him during the fighting, had not forgotten who actually brought the killing to an end. When he died of throat cancer in 1885, having spent his final months racing to finish his memoirs so his family would not be left in poverty, veterans from both the Union and Confederate armies came out by the hundreds of thousands to watch his funeral procession pass through New York. The nickname never fully disappeared from the history books, and it should not, since the men who died at Cold Harbor deserve to be remembered honestly rather than written out of the story to protect a general's reputation. But neither did the war he ended, and neither did the Union he helped hold together. If you want more stories like this, one pulled straight from the historical record, hit subscribe and stick around.